On August 18th, 1887, the afternoon temperature in Coldwater, Wyoming Territory stood at 74 degrees in the shade behind the depot wall, yet the dust already carried that dry metallic taste that old settlers associated with short autumns and long reckonings. Coldwater held 312 souls that summer, strung along one rail spur and a wagon road that reached spring freight if the crossings held. The town had one church, one schoolhouse, one general store, two boarding houses, and too much confidence in a supply system that worked only when weather and distance agreed to mercy. That day, a man named Roy Lawson stepped down from the westbound car with two trunks, a pressure kettle wrapped in canvas, and a ledger tied shut with twine. He paid 10 cents to a boy for hauling one trunk, carried the other himself, and did not pause to admire the street the way newcomers often did when trying to decide who might be useful to know. Roy was 36 years old, broad in the shoulders from hand labor and narrow in speech, with the weathered face of a man who had learned that arguments rarely changed outcomes, but preparation often did. He had been born in the lake country near Duluth to a Finnish mother and a father who cut timber when the rivers opened, and in that household winter was treated not as a season, but as an accounting of choices made months earlier. His mother, Ano Lawson, had buried one brother after a crop failure in her childhood village and never told the story as tragedy. She told it as instruction. She taught him to read a pantry as if it were a map, to tally salt and fuel before the first leaf turned, and to trust signs in water, birds, and fur when official forecasts were only hopeful talk. She had died in March of 1884 after a lung fever took hold during a thaw, but her methods had survived in notebooks, in habits, and in the rigid calm with which Roy handled every task that touched food. By his second morning in town, Roy could feel eyes following him from porch shade and hitching rail. He rented a half-sunk sod house at the far eastern edge of town, where the bank rose slightly above Willow Creek and wind could strike with little interruption, for $6 a month paid to a widow named Margaret Keene, whose son had left for mining country. The house had one main room, a stove that drew poorly, and a dugout section entered by a low door, 3 steps below grade. Men at the trough called it a stopgap place when Roy walked past. Roy measured the walls with a carpenter's rule, tested the soil by wetting and pressing a handful in his palm, and asked the widow whether he could line the dugout in stone at his own expense. She agreed if he repaired the stovepipe and did not move her late husband's bench from the porch. He paid 1 month in advance and began before sunrise the following day. By the final week of August, Roy heard his name tied to a pattern other people considered excessive, even by frontier standards. Roy bought jars in quantities that unsettled the clerk at Pemberton General Mercantile. First 2 crates, then 4, then whatever arrived on the next wagon from Laramie. Over 9 weeks, he purchased 900 glass jars, some quart and some pint, at prices between 7 and 11 cents each depending on size and shipment damage. He bought lids in batches, rubber rings by the pound, coarse salt by the sack, and vinegar strong enough to sting the eyes when uncorked. He paid cash each time, counting coins onto the plank counter in exact stacks, while other customers waited, and entered each purchase in his ledger that same night by lantern light. Silas Pemberton watched those transactions from behind the counter, smiling at first and then flattening his mouth as Roy asked for more stock. He was a large man with a polished broadcloth vest, heavy watch chain, and the kind of barbered beard that required daily care and disposable income. He had come to Coldwater in 1878 with a dry goods wagon, and now stood behind shelves crowded with flour, lamp oil, calico, nails, and patent tonics, the visible evidence of a man who profited by being necessary. When Roy asked for 6 more cases of jars on credit against future labor, Silas refused with a smile and raised his voice so half the store could hear. He said jars were for sensible wives preserving peaches and pickles, not for solitary men digging holes to hide from old winters that were not returning. Two teamsters laughed. A ranch hand repeated the line at the trough by evening, loud enough for Roy to hear as he passed with his handcart. Within 3 days, wherever Roy stopped, at the pump, outside the depot, beside the livery fence, someone was using the phrase Lawson Folly. Roy answered none of it. He hauled stone from the creek bed in a handcart, scrubbed each piece, and lined the dugout walls to shoulder height, leaving a 2-inch air gap where the original sod had begun to crumble. He laid plank shelves across cedar braces, 6 tiers on the long wall and 4 on the short, measuring each span to hold full jars without bowing. He cut a vent stack from discarded stovepipe sections and ran it through the north wall with a shutter plate that could be narrowed during severe cold, then packed the seam with clay and straw. He whitewashed the interior with lime to reduce mold and marked temperature points with charcoal at morning and midnight over 12 consecutive nights. The cellar settled near 52 degrees, while outside afternoons rose to 68 and dropped to 39 before dawn. He recorded every number. He altered nothing until the figures proved stable. The first week of September brought the turn that divided routine caution from urgent labor. On September 3rd, Roy rode north along Willow Creek and saw beaver dams built higher than he had ever seen that close to settlement. Mud and branchwork lifted well above ordinary flow. In the same morning, Sky he counted geese moving south in tight formations nearly 2 weeks ahead of the dates entered in hunting logs at the depot wall. That afternoon he found woolly bear caterpillars in bunch grass near the school fence, their bands near solid black with almost no rust at center, a sign his mother had always treated as warning rather than folklore. He rode back without speaking at the livery and wrote 3 words in his ledger: water, birds, fur. 2 days later, a freight notice was posted at the depot announcing washouts in Nebraska and uncertain delivery schedules through November. Roy stood in the depot crowd and heard a councilman say they should wait, citing the mild 58-degree afternoons and clear roads. Several ranchers called the concern overblown. One said autumn always made newcomers nervous. Roy read the notice once, folded his copy into his coat, and walked directly to the stable yard, where he sold his saddle horse, a steady bay gelding named Moss, for $42 to a freighter bound east. The sale drew quiet surprise because horseflesh was security on that frontier, but Roy converted the money by dusk into salt, vinegar, lids, and 2 wagon loads of fuel wood cut to stove length. From that week forward, he canned at scale. Beans were blanched and packed tight with brine measured by spoon weight. Carrots and turnips were parboiled before sealing. Venison was cubed, browned, and pressure processed in broth with rendered fat layered at top for preservation. He used a water bath method for high-acid mixtures and pressure kettling for meat and low-acid vegetables, timing each run with a pocket watch hung from a nail above the stove. Each jar was inspected for chips, sterilized in boiling water, filled to marked headspace, sealed and set to cool on clean boards away from drafts. Failed seals were consumed first or reprocessed within hours. Nothing was wasted. By lantern light, he logged fill weights, batch counts, lid failures, and shelf placement so that older stock could be rotated forward. He worked as if October were already a locked door, and he intended to hold the key himself, not for comfort, but for obligation still unnamed. The unnamed obligation found shape before dawn, when Roy split his ledger into 2 columns and wrote in careful block letters, Household Reserve and Town Reserve. He did not know names for the second column yet, but he left room for them. The stoveplate glowed a low red, the kettle hissed in intervals, and the room smelled of vinegar, hot iron, and the sweet earth breath that came through the dugout door. Outside, The night held at 34 degrees, warm enough for mud to cling and cold enough to remind a careful man that warmth in September did not bargain for mercy in January. 3 mornings later, by the 8th of September, he rose at 4, banked coals, and began the same sequence that would shape the next 10 weeks to the minute. Water on first, jars inspected against lamplight for hairline fractures, rings sorted by elasticity, beans soaked and weighed in 6-pound lots. He set chalk marks on the wall to measure output, 1 mark for each sealed jar that rang clean when tapped with a spoon. At noon, he hauled refuse to the pit behind the sod wall, then returned to the stove and ran 2 pressure cycles before dark. The work consumed wood faster than expected, and he recalculated fuel in the ledger, adding 11 cords to his projected need if weather closed roads by late November. Coldwater watched and translated discipline into spectacle. Boys ran beside his handcart and called him the jar man, until their mothers pulled them back by the sleeve. At Pemberton General Mercantile, 2 women at the cloth table lowered their voices when he entered, then raised them when he passed, repeating Lawson folly as if the phrase were town property. Church committee women, once polite in the way small settlements required, stopped sending notes about shared suppers and seat rotations. On the 2nd Sunday of September, Roy took a rear pew near the stove, and no one asked him forward when the offertory plates passed. He remained through the closing hymn, stood when others stood, and left without pause. Silas Pemberton learned quickly that ridicule could be monetized. On September 14th, he posted new chalk prices at opening bell. Jar lids up by 1/3, coarse salt up by 1/4, vinegar up by the gallon only. He blamed freight uncertainty and breakage losses. He did not mention the locked back room where he had begun stacking extra flour sacks and lamp oil tins beneath canvas. Roy saw the posted prices, counted his remaining cash, and bought what he needed without argument. Silas leaned both palms on the counter and said, with enough volume to carry into the nail aisle, that fear spread faster than disease, and that a settlement could survive weather but not panic. A ranch foreman laughed and said Roy would be canning dust by Christmas. Silas repeated it later at the feed trough, and by evening half the street had heard. Roy worked through every remark as if it were weather, not debate. He altered his process to reduce failure rates under heavier throughput, preheating jars in near-simmer water so glass did not crack when packed, skimming broth more carefully to keep fat seals clean, and setting a strict cooling shelf where no draft crossed the lids. He marked spoiled batches in red pencil and traced causes: insufficient headspace, rushed wipe, weak ring. By the 3rd week of September, his spoilage had fallen below 2 jars in 100. On peak days, when meat and fuel both held, he pushed 26 to 33 jars. Most days ran lower and steadier to preserve wood and reduce failures. The shelves in the first chamber filled from lower tier upward, each row dated and coded by contents. He rotated older seals to the front and tested random lids every 5th day. The cellar held steady between 50 and 54 degrees. The walls did what earth walls did when men trusted them. They absorbed. They released. They kept faith with physics rather than optimism. By the 1st week of October, frost silvered wagon ruts before sunrise, and Roy began the 2nd chamber. He had delayed until he could prove first cellar stability over 30 consecutive days, then committed all spare labor to expansion. The new room measured 16 feet by 10 feet, with a roof line cut deeper into the bank and supported by tamarack posts, scavenged from a dismantled corral. He dug to a depth of 7 feet at the rear wall, sloped the floor 1 inch per 4 feet toward a drainage trench, and lined the trench with rounded creek stone, so melt or seepage could move without pooling under shelf legs. Lumber for shelving cost him $19.40 at reduced quality grade. Nails and brackets cost $3.85. Additional lime for wash cost $1.10. He recorded each figure beside the date and source. He did not build in secret. The excavation sat visible from the East Road, and every passerby had opinion ready. A pair of teamsters asked whether he intended to bury himself early to save trouble later. A school father, sober and embarrassed by his own words even as he spoke them, said no decent settlement should allow one man to advertise calamity when families needed confidence. Silas called the excavation the Badger Burrow and set it in front of paying customers until the nickname fixed itself in local speech. Roy lifted another stone, set another brace, and answered a widow who offered concern with the only line he gave anyone that autumn: "Let them talk. Words do not keep out the wind." On October 11th, Town Council met in the rear room of the Mercantile to discuss supply assurances. Silas attended and argued that existing stocks were sufficient through any ordinary winter if souls avoided hoarding behavior. The council clerk copied his statement into minutes. No limit on private stockholding was set. No emergency coal order was authorized. Roy was not invited to speak, though 2 councilmen had purchased his extra turnips the week before, when local gardens failed early. The prevailing view held that visible preparation by one outsider would provoke scarcity by rumor alone. Evidence of vulnerability remained filed under inconvenience. Roy shifted from storage to access. He had learned in northern storms that provisions without root discipline became decoration. He drove stout posts from his porch to the well, then from the well to the schoolhouse side door, and from the schoolhouse to the church shed, sinking each post 3 feet and tamping soil with gravel for grip. Between posts he ran braided rope at waist height, doubled at corners with knots tied every 6 paces so gloved hands could count direction in whiteout. In clear weather, the lines looked theatrical. Children swung from them after lessons until a teacher scolded them off. Men at the pump said the town had acquired clotheslines for giants. Roy checked knots at dusk and retensioned slack after each wind. 3 days passed before the next warning arrived. On October 19th, a telegraph fragment reached the depot from east of Cheyenne reporting additional rail delays after washouts and bridge inspections farther south. The message was incomplete where line noise had clipped words. Council treated it as routine seasonal disruption. Roy treated it as confirmation. He purchased 2 more tons of coal at $8 per ton before price movement and stacked sacks under tarpaulin weighted with stone. By month end, those same sacks sold for $11.50 when available. In late October, the merchant shelves began to tell a quieter story than public speech. Flour bins were still broad at opening and narrowed by dusk. Lamp oil tins left the front display and reappeared only on request. Sugar remained, calico remained, patent tonics remained in bright rows, but staple barrels stood lower each market day. Silas grew sharper in manner, correcting clerks in front of customers, refusing bulk credit to families who had bought on account for years, and speaking of civic duty while his rear lock clicked more often. He still mocked Roy when opportunity presented itself, yet he had stopped laughing while doing so. The first week of November brought a brittle cold that failed to hold. Morning ice formed on trough edges. Then afternoon sun rose to 57 degrees and softened roadbeds into rutted clay. Ranchers called it proof of a gentle season. Store gossip turned toward Christmas cloth, new boots, and whether the traveling fiddler from Casper would return before snow. Families spent spare dollars on ribbon and lamp trim rather than extra coal, because danger that does not yet hurt has weak authority over immediate wants. Roy continued canning, now teaching Margaret Keene how to test seals and how to note bulging lids as hazard rather than waste. She became his first reliable second pair of hands and wrote her own measurements in a smaller ledger he purchased for 15 cents. By November 20th, Roy had sealed 872 jars fit for shelf, with projected completion of 900 before month end if lids held. He moved through the cellar rows with a stub of chalk and reassigned placement by caloric density, fats and meats at center where temperature variance was least, high-acid vegetables near the vent wall, broth in lower tiers for rapid access. He packed burlap curtains over the entry to reduce heat loss when doors opened during storms. He set aside cracked jaw jars for immediate use and noted abandonment beside each number so no one would trust them later by mistake. Then came the deceptive quiet. The final week of November settled windless and bright, with noon temperatures near 41 degrees and evenings mild enough that men lingered outside the mercantile discussing spring seed orders, as if winter had already declared itself manageable. The mountains west of Coldwater showed a pale rim of new snow, and then no more. Smoke rose straight from chimneys. Dogs slept in the street. Even Roy paused one evening at the porch rail and listened to a stillness so complete it invited belief. He did not accept the invitation. He checked the rope knots once more, tightened the vent shutter by a finger's width, and finished the final 28 jars under lantern light, each seal clicking down like a small, deliberate answer to a question the town had not yet been forced to ask. When the final lid settled and rang true, Roy lifted the jar, turned it once against the lantern, and wrote the number 900 in the ledger with a pressure that split the pencil tip. He did not celebrate. He cleared the cooling boards, reset the kettle, and began a second sequence that had never been about counting glass alone. Every jar was sorted again by weight, acid class, and expected shelf life, then entered onto a wall map of both cellar rooms, so any hand, even in dim light and hard weather, could find fat, broth, starch, or pickled greens in less than a minute. By late November, he had built narrow index shelves by the dugout stair, each marked in charcoal with ration codes for 1 sole, 3 soles, and 10. And he had tied duplicate tags of oiled paper to every 5th row in case lime wash flaked and obscured the markings. The project grew outward from storage into procedure, and procedure into a system broad enough to survive confusion. He split dry fuel into 3 classes: quick kindling, steady split pine, and dense cottonwood blocks for overnight holds, then stacked each class in separate bays under canvas so exhausted workers would not burn tomorrow in one hurried hour. He sealed 2 barrels of drinking water with tight pine bungs and set a 3rd open barrel by the stove for thawing ice, reducing traffic to the well when wind turned dangerous. He cut scrap planks into stove schedules and bored holes for pegs, 1 board for each cluster of homes nearest his rope lines, so heat could be shared by rotation if coal disappeared from private bins. On November the 25th, he paid $2.60 for additional lamp chimneys and wick stock, and another $1.20 for coarse soap, because illness in winter settled first where hands and cookware were neglected. Margaret Keene joined him each morning after first light and took over inspection work with the disciplined patience of a widow who had measured hardship before. Roy taught her to read seals by 3 tests in fixed order: sight for concavity, touch for flex, and sound for ring, and she taught him which families were too proud to ask for help until hunger had already narrowed their options. Together, they repacked cracked lip jars for immediate distribution and marked them with black X symbols, so no one would gamble on them later. On November the 26th, they began assembling standardized food bundles in nail kegs, each bundle containing broth, beans, root vegetables, and rendered fat for 5 days at reduced labor, and each keg tied with twine lengths cut to the same measure so frozen fingers could untie them quickly. This was no longer one man preserving his own winter. It was logistics. By the 4th day after the 900th jar, the growth of Roy work became the most discussed fact in Coldwater, and the most resented. Men who had laughed at his cellar now spoke of it as a provocation, saying constant visible preparation invited dread and unsettled trade. Silas Pemberton gave that sentiment a polished shape. He posted a notice at the mercantile door stating that bulk sales of staples would be restricted to recognized household accounts in good standing, then explained to waiting customers that order required discipline, not private stockpiling by men with no dependents under their roof. The phrasing carried accusation without naming Roy, yet every soul on that boardwalk understood the target. Silas stood beneath his own full shelves, broad in the chest and still dressed in clean vest and pressed trousers, and called loss and folly a fever that had to be managed before it spread into purchasing panic. The mockery was no longer idle speech passed at the pump. It became organized exclusion with moral language attached. Church deacons, embarrassed but obedient to prevailing pressure, asked Roy to store his work clothes behind the rear vestibule if he wished to attend evening service, because the odor of vinegar and meat stock was said to distract devotions. A committee planning the Advent meal omitted his name from contribution requests, then thanked him publicly for understanding when no invitation followed. At the schoolhouse fence, older boys repeated their father's lines about the Badger burrow and staged pantomimes of digging and hiding whenever Roy crossed the East Road with a handcart. He neither rebuked nor argued. He adjusted the load straps and kept moving. Coldwater interpreted silence as surrender because the town had little experience with men whose discipline was not theatrical. On November the 27th, at a council discussion called to address complaints about supply fairness, Silas pushed farther. He argued that rope lines fixed through public lanes represented unauthorized structures that implied civic emergency where none had been declared, and he requested authority to remove any line crossing commercial frontage. 2 councilmen agreed in principle. One dissented quietly and asked whether the lines did real harm. No vote was taken, but by evening 2 posts near the alley behind the mercantile had been loosened in their sockets and one rope cut clean with a blade. Roy found the damage at dusk, replaced the post with a heavier timber sunk deeper in gravel, and doubled the line with an offset knot pattern that could not be severed in one stroke. He reported nothing. He wrote the event in the ledger as maintenance, then noted the location with a square mark that meant vulnerable to tampering. The same night, Roy moved from contingency to instruction. He invited Margaret and 2 other adults, Hannah Pike from the laundry and Emil Sorensen from the rail yard, to the cellar for a 3-hour drill on ration issue, stove safety, and spoilage triage. They practiced by lamplight with gloves on, passing jars hand to hand, reading labels aloud, and timing retrieval from shelf to stove table. Roy required each to repeat the brine ratio for emergency pickling and the boil interval for suspect meat stock. He made them rehang the dugout door curtain until it fell tight with no side gap. When Emil asked why so strict when the weather remained calm, Roy answered in his measured way that weather did not announce itself according to comfort, and systems failed first where assumptions replaced sequence. He gave each trainee a copied page of instructions in pencil block, wrapped in waxed paper against snow. By the last week of November, warning signs assembled with the same cold logic that had governed his whole method. On the morning of November the 28th, horses in 3 separate lots turned their hindquarters to the northwest despite mild air and clear sky, holding that posture for long stretches as if against a wind not yet present. Cattle near Willow Creek drifted from open water to higher ground before dusk without prodding. Roy knelt by the creek bank and measured new skim ice over running sections that had remained open the prior night, then watched bubbles freeze in clustered patterns his mother had taught him to treat as a marker of abrupt pressure change. He broke one pane with his glove, smelled the water, and found the mineral sharpness that often preceded fast cold after false warmth. He returned to town and added 2 words to the ledger beneath water: birds, fur, pressure, ground. At the depot, telegraph traffic confirmed what the sky concealed. The operator, Lewis Dunn, showed Roy a strip of broken text received from the east at 10:40 in the forenoon. Rail movement slowed, bridge concerns unresolved, line interruptions expected after nightfall. The westbound wire had already gone intermittent and then silent. Dunn said repairs would hold if weather stayed ordinary, and that dispatch remained hopeful. Hopeful was not a schedule. Roy asked for the last confirmed freight location and learned that 6 cars of flour and coal remained far downline, delayed again by inspection. He paid 3 cents for a copy of the message and folded it into the same ledger pocket where earlier warnings were kept. By sunset, he had shifted 2/3 of his accessible stock from the outer chamber to interior shelves with lower temperature swing. The town read the same signals through a different framework. Noon held at 43 degrees on November the 29th, and sunlight poured across the street with such easy brightness that women lingered over bolt cloth and men debated spring fencing contracts as though winter had softened out of principle. Silas stood at his door and declared that prudent commerce, not alarm, would carry cold water through any ordinary season. He sold decorated lamp trim, imported coffee at a premium, and limited coal to small lots while insisting larger reserves remain secure. Several families, stung by rising prices but reassured by his confidence, bought holiday goods and deferred fuel purchases 1 more week. Roy watched these transactions without comment and returned to his cellar, where he recalculated per household endurance based on reduced external supply and wrote a new line under town reserve: 187 souls, probable support if strict rationing begins within first week. On November the 30th, the atmosphere changed in ways less visible than storm clouds and more decisive than rumor. Smoke from breakfast chimneys failed to rise cleanly and instead flattened low over roof lines, drifting east in thin layers that stung the eyes. Sound carried strangely across distance, hammer strikes from the blacksmith arriving sharp and then muffled, as if the air itself had thickened unevenly. Roy checked his hanging barometer, an old instrument carried west in one of his trunks, and recorded a fall from 29.6 to 28.9 inches within 14 hours, faster than any drop he had logged since arriving in Coldwater. He tightened every rope knot from porch to schoolhouse by hand, leaving wool wraps at each corner post to protect skin from freeze adhesion, and hung red cloth markers at shoulder height where drifts were likely to swallow the lower line. That evening he went house to house along the East Road and delivered a message stripped of argument. Keep kettles filled overnight. Move kindling indoors. Sleep with boots near the bed. If visibility collapsed, follow rope. Never open ground. Some thanked him with guarded courtesy. Some closed doors before he finished speaking. At the Pike Laundry, Hannah accepted 2 kegs and repeated his instructions back to him without mistake. At the Sorensen cabin, Emil set his shovel by the threshold and tied his mittens to his coat cord exactly as taught. At the Mercantile, Silas listened from the doorway. Coat collar turned up through the wind had not yet risen, and answered that public warning without council declaration bordered on sabotage. Roy nodded once, set down the copied telegraph strip on the counter edge, and left without waiting for reply. After midnight, the calm thinned. A light wind came first from the south, then failed, then returned from the west in uneven pulses that rattled loose boards and tested every latch in town. By 4 in the morning of December 1st, the porch thermometer that had read 41 degrees at noon the day before had already fallen below 0 and was still dropping toward the -19 that would be logged before dawn, while the pressure kept falling and a hard glitter had formed along the rope fibers where moisture flash froze between gusts. He banked the stove, laid out ration boards by the dugout stair, and waited beside the door in his coat. Not because he expected to be vindicated, but because sequence demanded readiness before weather announced its full name. He heard the first hard grains strike the sod wall at 4:17 in the morning. Not snow at first, but sleet driven flat. And by 5 o'clock, the wind had become a continuous force out of the northwest that bent chimney smoke horizontal and packed ice into every hinge in town. At 5:40, Roy opened his door against a shove of white and tested the nearest rope with both gloves. It held. The red marker cloth snapped straight as wire. Visibility had already fallen below 20 paces, and the porch thermometer, read by lantern through rime, stood at -19 degrees. By sunrise, Coldwater had lost its edges. Road, fence, ditch, and railbed merged into one moving field where drifts formed and reformed in minutes. Men who had planned to shovel in teams could not keep direction 10 yards from their own steps. 2 horses at the livery panicked and tore halters loose, then vanished into the whiteness before their handlers reached the gate. Roy moved out on his line to the well, body angled into the gusts, counting knots beneath his palm exactly as drilled, then returned with 1/2 barrel of water and a face crusted in frost. He posted his first ration board at the dugout stair in charcoal, large enough to read through blowing snow. Broth 1 ladle per soul at noon, beans and roots at dusk, fuel by stove schedule only. At 9:10, Lewis Dunn at the depot attempted westbound wire, then eastbound, then westbound again. The key returned only static and broken clicks. Before noon, a section hand ran in with word that 2 telegraph poles had snapped west of Granite Cut, their lines dragging and then buried. By 1 in the afternoon, the rail spur disappeared under a drift that rose past the axle height of a freight wagon left beside the siding. The final confirmed freight cars remained downline beyond reach, and every soul who understood shipping knew what that meant without saying it aloud. Relief was no longer delayed. Relief had become theoretical. Silas Pemberton kept his mercantile open through the first day. Lanterns lit at both front windows and sold flour at new chalk rates that climbed again before dusk. He stood in his broad vest with a scarf tied over his mouth, asserting in a strained voice that order would prevent panic. But order weakened as quickly as daylight. Families arrived in bursts between gusts, boots wrapped in sacks for traction, and bought whatever staples could be carried under one arm. By evening, the front flour bin showed its first bare plank at the bottom. A woman asked for coal on account and was refused. Another offered silver buttons for lamp oil and was refused. Silas locked the rear room twice in 1 hour, while customers watched with hollow eyes. The storm did not pass in the night. It deepened. By December 2nd, noon temperature reached -24. The wind carved drifts to window height on the east side of town, then shifted and packed the west lanes shut. Roy moved along the ropes every 4 hours with Emil Sorensen and Hannah Pike, chopping ice from knots, resetting one post near the schoolhouse that had heaved loose, and tying a second guideline to the church shed when the first began to disappear under a dune of hard snow. They traveled clipped together by short lengths of rope at the waist. They spoke little. All 3 knew that words spent breath needed elsewhere. At the Lawson cellar, process replaced fear where process could. Margaret Keene managed intake and seal checks at the door table. Roy issued jars by code, never by pleading volume, and logged every release with date, contents, and receiving household, so no cluster would go dark by mistake. 3 volunteer women came on staggered shifts, Hannah Pike, Marta Ellison, and Ingrid Sorensen, and learned to warm frozen jars gradually so glass would not break and food would not be lost. Roy corrected hand position, boil times, and ladle sanitation with the same calm used on construction days. The walls held at 51 to 53 degrees. Outside, Whole rooms in frame houses dropped below freezing by late afternoon. On the third day, December the 3rd, a deceptive lull came at dawn, wind falling long enough that several men attempted open crossing without rope to reach stored wood behind their homes. At 7:30, the gust front returned like a gate slamming shut. One man crawled back by sound of his own dog barking from the porch. Another reached only his fence and stayed there until neighbors hauled him inside by a coat sleeve. Roy kept repeating the same instruction at every handoff. If sight fails, stop moving and find rope. If rope is not in reach, kneel and wait for line team. That night, Clara Beale died. She was 62, widowed 5 winters, and known for stacking kindling in exact square tiers behind her house. Near 8 in the evening, with her stove fading and her nephew delayed at the rail bunkhouse, she tied a sash cord from porch rail to the first wood stack and stepped out with a lantern shielded in a bucket. The knot at the porch post had been tied in haste by cold fingers and never tested under load. A gust hit broadside as she cleared the steps. The cord snapped at the porch ring. Searchers found her after midnight less than 30 feet from her own pile, one hand still closed around 2 sticks of pine she had managed to gather. Roy wrote her name in the ledger margin beside fuel notes and set aside 2 jars for the wake meal, though no formal wake could be held in that weather. By December 6th, the first whiteout had run 4 full days, and when sky finally lifted to a hard gray, Coldwater looked as if it had been lowered into snow up to its eaves. The schoolhouse door opened only after men tunneled from leeward side. The church roof held but leaked at the seam above the vestibule. The depot drifted to second window sash, and no rail line was visible in either direction. Silas opened his store to discover one front window cracked by pressure, and the rear loading door jammed by ice from outside and grain sacks from inside. Shelves that had once signaled his certainty now showed long interruptions of bare wood. Flour was gone by New Year. Lamp oil dwindled to rationed half pints. Coffee and patent tonics remained because hunger had no use for either. 3 days passed before the next major storm arrived, and those 3 days created a dangerous illusion that labor alone could recover lost ground. Men cut trenches, women hauled snow for melt, and families inventoried cupboards with increasing silence. Then, on December 10th, another front came from the west with finer snow and lower temperature, -31 by dawn of the 11th, wind less violent but more constant, the kind that steals heat through every wall seam and under every door. Roy shifted from daily distribution to strict intervals, posted stove rotations by household cluster, and moved the highest calorie stock to immediate access shelves. Deputy Tom Weaver died during that second week. He was 31, broad-handed, recently sworn as deputy when the previous marshal left for Cheyenne. On December the 12th, a drift collapsed against the church-side entrance while 6 children and their teacher waited inside after morning shelter prayer. Tom took 2 men and began cutting from the top because the lower drift had frozen to near ice. They worked in turns of 5 minutes to keep fingers functional. Near the final foot, with voices audible from inside, a slab of wind-packed snow slid from the eave and drove Tom against the outer jamb. The others cleared him and got the door open. The children and teacher came out alive on rope. Tom did not survive the exposure that followed. He was carried to the church hall wrapped in 2 quilts and his own coat, and every soul present understood the arithmetic of 1 man spent, so others could walk out. January opened with 19 days below -30 degrees before month end, and Coldwater began to fail room by room. Uninsulated walls iced over from within, cisterns split along old seams. Families burned chair legs, then bed slats, then fence rails. Contaminated meltwater brought fever where clean barrels had not been set aside early. Eli Madsen, 9 years old, fell sick with high fever after drinking contaminated meltwater when his family's cistern cracked. Hannah Pike boiled what she could and carried broth from Roy stores. But by January 18th, his breathing had grown shallow and then ceased before dawn, his mother holding his hand under blankets stiff with frost at the edges. Roy marked another name, another date, and increased soap allotment despite dwindling stock. By the first week of February, 7 major storms had struck since December began, and drift depth on the East Road swallowed wagon wheels to the hub, where abandoned carts lay tilted like markers in a white sea. Hunger narrowed tempers. Pride narrowed faster. At Pemberton Mercantile, the last private sacks in the rear room could not be protected by lock once neighbors understood there would be no immediate freight and no hidden abundance capable of feeding a town. Silas posted one final price list and tore it down the same hour because no one could pay with coin for goods that no longer existed in meaningful quantity. His gold watch chain remained on his vest out of habit, but the vest hung loose now, and the authority it once advertised had drained into simple fatigue. The help came to Roy in 2 forms on the same evening. Near sunset on February 7th, Marta Ellison arrived first with a scarf iced hard across her mouth, guiding 2 elders along the rope from the schoolhouse line. She did not ask for favors. She stated facts in a voice worn thin by cold. 3 stoves out on the south row, 1 family with no fuel, 1 with fever, and no broth left in their cluster keg. Roy handed her a written issue slip, then carried 2 kegs to the line himself with Emil and Margaret, assigning Ingrid to hold the cellar table in his absence. He expanded the soup fire to double kettle, shifted tomorrow ration forward by 6 hours, and ordered every household runner to return clean jars before first light for immediate refill. No one argued. Sequence had become law. An hour later, while wind scraped the sod wall and the second kettle began to steam, Silas Pemberton stepped through the dugout door. Snow had crusted his beard white. 1 sleeve was torn at the cuff. He removed his gloves slowly as if ashamed of how his hands trembled, and stood beside the ration board he had once mocked from a warm doorway. When he spoke, the voice carried no public polish, only exhaustion and a plain request. He said his store was finished as a source, his rear reserves misjudged, and his own clerks were hungry. He asked not for credit terms and not for special allotment. He asked for food and method, and he asked what he should tell the souls still waiting in his line. Roy did not answer with triumph. He pulled a blank board from beneath the stair, set it on the table, and wrote distribution intervals in charcoal, while Margaret assembled jars for transfer. He told Silas to open his front room at first light as a warming station under stove rotation, to surrender the backroom key to a 3-household committee, and to post fair shares by count of souls, not by account balance. He told him to send his strongest clerk to rope maintenance at dawn and his youngest clerk to water boil duty under Hannah Pike. Then he placed 2 jars of broth and 1 of beans into Silas' hands and pointed to the kettle. "Carry this first," he said. "Learn the order while you walk." Silas took the jars in both hands, turned into the wind, and followed the knots toward his own dark doorway, while Emil walked behind him with a coal scuttle and a shovel. Roy watched until the red marker at the corner post swallowed them. Then he closed the dugout door, struck the next line on the ration board, and began teaching 2 new runners how to lift hot glass with folded wool instead of bare mittens. Through the second week of February, rescue in Coldwater did not look like heroics. It looked like sequence repeated without error. Roy kept issue intervals at 6 hours, then 8 when stores stabilized, and posted every change in charcoal outside both cellar doors so no rumor could outrun arithmetic. Margaret Keene managed incoming empties, rejecting chipped rims no matter who presented them. Hannah Pike supervised boil kettles at the former mercantile warming room and sent back written slips for each household cluster. Souls present, fuel remaining, fever cases, clean water status. Silas, who had once declared fear contagious, now stood by the stove and read those slips aloud to clerks with cracked hands and hollow cheeks, then copied them into a new ledger under Roy instruction. 3 days after Silas arrived at the cellar, Roy moved 24 jars and 1/2 barrel of split pine into the church hall and converted the vestibule into a night station for rope teams. The schoolhouse kept children and elders by daylight whenever wind eased enough for escorted movement. The mercantile front room, emptied of non-essential stock, became a warming house where stove rotation was enforced by pegboard and hour marks cut into scrap plank. No one paid coin. No one received extra by standing louder. The old price lists were burned for kindling on the 11th of February, and Silas fed the pages into the stove himself without ceremony. By the 18th of February, the temperature rose briefly to -6 at noon and dropped again after dusk, but the pause allowed Roy to inspect both chambers end to end. He counted 117 jars remaining from the full reserve, plus 8 marked unsafe from freeze fracture and set aside for disposal. He revised allotments in red pencil, reducing broth issue by 1 ladle in low-labor households and increasing rendered fat issue for storm crews burning through calories on line maintenance. Expensive errors in town stood in plain contrast to that careful thrift. Homes built quickly with thin plank walls consume fuel at triple projected rates. Coal purchased late at panic prices had vanished by January. Goods bought for display, imported coffee, ribbon, polished lamp trim, lay useless beside empty bins, while jars bought at 7 to 11 cents and shelved in earth kept breath in 187 souls. The weather struck twice more before month end, one storm on February 21st and another on the night of the 27th, both with hard drifting that buried lower rope lines and forced teams to work by upper knots alone. No new deaths followed. The difference was method shared. At each shift, Change Roy required spoken handover. What was issued, what failed, what was repaired, what remained. Silas learned to repeat that order without embellishment. So did councilmen who had once dismissed rope posts as theater. By the first week of March, even the boys who had mocked the Badger Burrow were assigned to carry thawed water and stacked firewood between stations under supervision, and they performed the task with solemn care that had not been seen in them before winter. On March 9th, with sky clear for a full day, Lewis Dunn reached the depot roof and reset a damaged insulator line long enough to send a short eastbound report. Cold water isolated, casualties 3, supplies managed by a local ration system, request rail cut crews at thaw. The reply did not come. The message still mattered. Dunn handed Roy a copy, and Roy folded it beside the older telegraph strips already stiff with wear. Physical proof had outlived argument. The first wagon from outside did not arrive until April 14th, when thaw crews cut through Granite Cut and reached the depot yard with 3 mules, 2 sledges, and men wearing river mud to their knees. They brought flour, coal, and the explanation that removed every remaining pretense. In November, an ice surge on the Platte had smashed bridge supports and left 6 freight cars immobilized 113 miles downline, cargo intact and unreachable all winter. Relief had not been delayed by paperwork or caution. Relief had been impossible by timber and water. Roy laid the depot copy beside his own stored notices and said nothing while the council clerk wrote the finding into the town book. Reckoning came the way thaw comes in hard country, not as one speech, but as ground slowly giving way under weight. Families began returning jars, cleaned, dried, and labeled in pencil with contents and date consumed. Some arrived with thanks spoken plainly. Some set crates on the porch and left before dawn. Men who had laughed at rope lines asked to borrow post augers and knot diagrams. Women who had repeated the jarman name at cloth tables asked Margaret for brine measures and boil timings, then copied them in careful script. The derisive phrase loss and folly remained in speech for a few weeks, then shifted in meaning without announcement. By planting season, when someone said a plan looked like loss and folly, they meant it was severe, exact, and likely to save lives. Silas came on a gray morning near the end of April, carrying a wrapped parcel and no ledger. His coat had been mended at both elbows. He set the parcel on Roy table and opened it to reveal a brass key and a folded deed transfer for his second warehouse lot on the South Lane. He said he had sold the parcel at reduced value and placed the proceeds, $486 after debt settlement, with the council to raise a public preserving shed, with posted fair prices for lids and salt and no private reserve lock during declared emergency months. He spoke in a steady voice until the final line, then stopped and began again. He said he had called Roy work fever, had profited while warning others against panic, and had protected stock by account standing when survival required a different measure. He did not ask to be excused. He asked for instruction on how to prevent repetition. 2 evenings later, at church, after benches were reset from winter shelter use, more than 200 souls gathered in work coats and patched gloves rather than Sunday dress. There was no formal agenda and no order of speeches. One by one, named voices filled the room. A school father acknowledged calling rope lines a public nuisance while relying on those same lines to bring his daughters to warmth. A teamster admitted he had helped cut one rope in November behind the Mercantile and had told no one until then. A deacon said he had asked Roy to sit at the rear pew because the smell of vinegar offended devotion, and that he now understood devotion better in a cellar than he had at polished rail. No one spoke long. No one dramatized. Shame in that room was specific. When the speaking settled, all attention turned to Roy. He remained standing near the side wall, hands scarred from winter rope and kettle handles, and answered in the same measured register he had used when teaching SEAL checks in Stormlight. He said his mother taught that food was a promise made in summer to strangers one had not yet met, and that a promise was not a bargain requiring courtesy in advance. He said the dead should not be used as decoration for anyone's moral comfort, because Clara Beale, Tom Weaver, and Eli Matson were not lessons but lives. He said words in that room mattered only if they became practice in every house, every ledger, every market day when weather looked kind. Then he set terms that were not punishment. Each household would keep a winter ledger reviewed in October. Each block would maintain at least one shared cellar plan. Preserving shed prices would be posted publicly from August through November, and training would be open to any hand willing to learn, regardless of rank, church standing, or account history. He said he would teach. Whether anyone called that forgiveness was for them to decide by conduct. By June, framing began on the public shed, 22 feet by 30, east wall earth bermed to shoulder height, with vented cool room and a wash station built from salvaged pump parts. Silas stood beside Hannah Pike and Margaret Keene on opening day and nailed the first price board in plain view. Lids, rings, salt, vinegar, all margins fixed and signed by 3 keepers, not one proprietor. Roy refused any title over the building, but he accepted one condition from the council, that his process pages be copied into a town manual stored at depot, church, schoolhouse, and shed. The manual included spoilage tests, fuel classes, rope knot maps, and the telegraph chronology from autumn to thaw, so memory would remain anchored to dates and costs instead of softened by pride. Years later, Coldwater did not tell the winter as a tale of one wise man and many fools. It told it as a hard correction paid for by 3 graves and one disciplined refusal to let resentment govern supply. By October 1896, the settlement counted 428 souls. Every home kept at least one cellar chart with temperature marks, and most kept 2. Children learned knot counts before they learned hymn verses. The preserving shed ran 6 days a week in harvest months, and no merchant in town could raise lid prices without posting freight invoices beside the board for all to inspect. Lewis Dunn old telegraph strips, the washed-out freight notices, and Roy original ration ledger were wrapped in oilcloth and stored in a pine box at the school, then read aloud each first week of September to new families arriving by rail. The phrase "building like Lawson" entered common speech across 2 counties, carried by teamsters and marriage kin, and it meant a structure or a plan made for weather that had not yet announced itself. Roy remained in the half-sunk sod house for several more years, then moved to a small frame place near the shed, only after Margaret insisted the old roof had earned retirement. He continued teaching without charge. Silas continued posting fair prices and, when drought years came, opened his books for inspection before anyone asked. The cellar still stands in Coldwater, earth-packed and lime-washed, cooler than summer and kinder than winter, and on the inside lintel above the first chamber door, there are carved words in plain block letters, cut by an unknown hand, sometime after that hard season. Summer owes the stranger. The day those carved words were first noticed, Roy was carrying a crate of returned quart jars down the dugout steps, while Margaret Keene held the lantern high to keep his footing clear. The light struck the inside lintel and both stopped at once. Summer owes the stranger had been cut into the wood in steady block letters, deep enough to survive years of damp and use. Roy set the crate down, touched the grooves with 2 fingers, and looked back toward the open door, where afternoon light fell across packed earth and stone shelf edges, worn smooth by winter hands. Margaret asked who had done it. Roy said the cut was made by someone who knew a sharp knife and took time with each stroke. 3 evenings later, after preserving class ended at the new public shed, Silas Pemberton lingered beside the wash station while the last kettles cooled. He had set his gold watch aside for work months earlier, and now his sleeves were rolled in the same way as every other hand in that room, forearms reddened by steam and lye soap. Roy was stacking lid rings by size when Silas said he had seen the inscription and had asked 3 clerks whether they knew the carver. None did. He said he had considered carving his own name beneath it, not from vanity but from guilt, then decided that would be another attempt to place himself at the center of a sentence earned by others. Roy answered that some things were better left unattributed, because anonymous truth often lasted longer than signed regret. Silas nodded once and returned to scrubbing the kettle rims. By the second week of September 1897, the preserving shed had settled into routine that looked plain from the road and rigorous from within. Price boards were posted at dawn with freight invoices pinned beside them, exactly as promised. Lids held at 8 cents when shipments were strong and rose only when documented breakage justified it. Salt sacks were weighed on a balanced beam in full view of customers. Vinegar barrels were tapped only after 2 keepers confirmed the measure. Hannah Pike supervised brine ratios at one table, while Margaret checked seal integrity at another, and Roy moved between stations correcting wrist angle, headspace, and cooling order with the same calm authority that had kept panic from wasting food in the whiteout. The contrast remained visible to any soul willing to see it. The shed itself had cost less than 1 winter of panic pricing in the old mercantile, yet it produced twice the useful reserve because waste was tracked and methods were shared. Homes that copied the earth berm design used 1/3 less fuel through December than thin plank houses built for speed and pride, Families that kept written ledgers lost fewer jars to spoilage than families relying on memory and confidence. The expensive failures of 1887 had been purchased in broadcloth and certainty. The modest successes that followed were purchased in soap, stone, twine, and patient repetition. On a cold morning in late October, Lewis Dunn walked from the depot to the schoolhouse carrying a pine box under oilcloth and asked Roy to witness the storage of records before first frost. They opened the box on the teacher desk. Telegraph strips from the washed-out weeks, council copies, Roy original ration ledger, Silas revised winter ledger from the warming room, and the depot note confirming 6 freight cars immobilized 113 miles downline by Platte Bridge failure. Dunn added one final sheet in his own careful hand, stating that no complete eastbound reply to his 9th March distress report had ever reached Coldwater, and that the absence itself was now part of the record, proof that local method had stood where distant systems had gone silent. Roy signed as witness. So did Hannah Pike and the schoolteacher, Eliza Ward. That afternoon, the teamster who had once cut a rope behind the mercantile, Jacob Tull, found Roy at the line post near the schoolhouse and removed his hat before speaking. He said he had confessed in church, but had not said all of it. He had cut the rope under instruction from no councilman and no merchant, only from his own resentment at being corrected by a man he called outsider. He had watched the same line carry his sister children to warmth in February and had slept poorly since. Roy listened without interruption, then handed Jacob an auger and told him to set the replacement post deeper than last year, because frost heave would test shallow work first. Jacob worked until dark. He set 3 posts, tamped each with gravel, and tied knots exactly 6 paces apart. He kept returning each autumn for the same task, and he never again crossed a line with a blade. By November 3rd, training expanded from adults to children under strict supervision, because Roy insisted that not counting, clean water order, and stove rotation were not emergency tricks but civic literacy. The schoolhouse yard held 12 students in mittens too large for their wrists, each practicing on a rope stretched between fence posts. Eliza Ward called numbers while the children moved hand over hand, with eyes closed, counting knots allowed to learn direction without sight. Inside, older students copied winter ledger templates onto slate, listing columns for souls, fuel class, water source, and seal checks. At the edge of the yard, Silas stood beside Margaret and read each child count, correcting gently where fear made speed outrun accuracy. On January 18, 1898, the first anniversary of Eli Madsen's death, Coldwater gathered at the cemetery ridge after noon meal with no speeches announced beforehand. Roy brought 3 jars from the new harvest, 1 broth, 1 beans, 1 pickled roots, and set them on a small table near the stones for Clara Beale, Tom Weaver, and Eli. Hannah Pike read their names. Deputy Weaver's successor spoke 2 sentences about service measured in minutes that cost a life and saved many. Eli's mother placed a boiled water kettle by the path and poured cups for every soul present before she drank herself, a quiet ritual that made the lesson plain without ornament. No one invoked destiny. No one called the losses necessary. They called them preventable, and then they turned that word into policy again. In April 1898, when thaw mud climbed wagon wheels and Willow Creek ran high, Roy and Silas rode out with 2 ranchers to inspect the beaver dams that had first signaled the hard winter. The dams were high again that year, though not as extreme. Geese flight came near ordinary dates. Caterpillar bands showed mixed rust and black. Roy taught the party to record all signs together and never trust any one marker alone. Silas took notes with the same pencil he once used for price lists. At the creek bank, he admitted, in front of witnesses and without drama, that he had treated observation as superstition because it came from hands he considered socially lesser. Roy answered that weather did not sort truth by social rank, and the ranchers wrote that line into their own pocketbooks. A decade later, on September 6, 1908, the schoolhouse was too small for the annual First Frost lecture, so benches were set in the church hall, and the pine box records were carried across town by 4 students chosen for careful hands. Roy, gray at the temples and slower on stairs but still exact in speech, stood beside Eliza Ward and watched children read telegraph strips aloud, including clipped words and static marks, so they could hear uncertainty in the artifact itself. Afterward, each household representative copied current freight invoices, cellar temperatures, and reserve targets into fresh ledgers. The phrase "building like Lawson" was spoken that evening by 2 new families from Up Valley who had never seen the 1887 whiteout, yet already understood the phrase meant preparing enough for 1 household and 2 more. The inscription on the cellar lintel remained unsigned. Souls asked about it every year. Some thought Tom Weaver, younger brother, had carved it after the thaw. Some claimed Margaret had done it with her kitchen knife before sunrise. Lewis Dunn once said the cut angle looked like a telegraph clerk hand, then smiled and refused to elaborate. No one ever claimed it in public, and no one was pressed to do so. The sentence did its work without ownership. The cellar still stands in Coldwater. The shed still opens each August. Children still learn knots before first snow. Freight invoices still hang beside price boards, where any eye can test them. In winter, when wind flattens smoke along rooflines and old fear begins to whisper, hands move by sequence learned from ledgers, ropes, and stone-cooled shelves, and strangers arriving late are fed before their names are written.